Story 1. My parents got divorced when I was 5. I have two younger siblings who were 4 and 2 at the time. Being in the 1970s, my mother was automatically awarded full custody. She promptly met another man and moved us to a different state. She called my father one day and told him to come get us or she would put us in foster care. She had gotten heavily into drugs and no longer wanted to be a mother. My father sold everything he could to get us back home. He paid for a lawyer and obtained full custody. I cannot imagine how hard it was to raise 3 small children, but he did it when he could have walked away. My childhood was not easy, but he will always be a hero in my eyes. Story 2. He cheated on my mother as a wild alcoholic, but then turned his life around, salvaged their relationship, held down a job, and was a constant presence in our lives thereafter. Story 3. My intense dad was doing Ironman triathlons in his 50s. He would run across the finish line where we were standing, come up to us, and ask, "Where are we eating tonight?" as if he had just woken up from a nap. He also recently built a plane from scratch with his bare hands. Not some small Cessna, but a high-performance experimental plane. I just remembered this and I cannot decide which is more impressive. By popular demand, I have a picture of the plane. It is called a Long Easy. It is obviously not built from his design, but I still would not get in a plane I built myself in a hangar. Story 4. After getting my mom pregnant with me in college, he married her immediately and supported us by taking a full-time job in a steel foundry while finishing college full-time. After being 3 feet away from dying in a foundry accident, he finished his degree, got a full-time job, and supported my mom, my 2 sisters, and me throughout our childhood and beyond. He worked extra weekend construction jobs to put me and my sisters through college with no debt. My mother was able to be a stay-at-home mom throughout our childhood because of him. He protected both of my sisters from predators and abusers, and they trusted him even if they couldn't see it for themselves. Now he supports and cares for his senile mother and acts as support for his brothers and sister. He is the rock of the family and an absolute hero. Story 5. Surviving as a prisoner of war in World War II in Germany after being shot down and spending a short time in the underground. Story 6. One time, my older brother threw a heavy dining room chair at my father's head. My father raised one hand and blocked it. It broke his hand, but he didn't flinch. He has probably done more impressive things in his life, but that one stands out because I witnessed it. Story 7. Worked every day that he could. Did the best job he could. Earned the most he could. Stayed loyal to my mother his entire life. Thought I was awesome. Was happy to see me every time I came over. Story 8. They kicked down my door at 2 a.m. when a tornado was rolling through our neighborhood. They threw me into a downstairs closet, then went outside and pulled our elderly neighbor out of what was left of her house. I was 9 years old. Story 9. Turned down 2 promotions because he knew it would take time away from the children. Instead, he made extra quick cash by volunteering to go on test flights when new planes arrived at the hangar. This was in the early to mid-1960s. The stories he told about those flights would make your hair curl, but having been in the war, it was nothing to him. Those flights paid well and helped support us, 9 children with 1 income. Story 10. When I was 8 years old, my family was in a plane crash on a pitch-black February night in Nebraska with temperatures in the low teens. When the plane came to a stop, my mother was dead, having been ejected. 3 of the 4 children, including myself, were unconscious. My younger brother's leg was caught under the fuselage. My oldest brother, who was 10, was still conscious. My father was an orthopedic surgeon but did rotations in the emergency room. Despite being nearly blind from swelling facial injuries and having recently suffered a separated shoulder in a ski accident, he got us out of the barbed wire-wrapped plane. We had slid through several fields, and luckily the ground was frozen. He protected us from the cold with clothing from the plane, and we sat for 8 hours while rescue did not come. When the storm cleared a little, he saw headlights in the far distance and left us with my older brother. He hiked 4 miles to a highway and flagged down a car. After we were transported to a hospital in a very small town, my father found the door locked. A nurse told him the doctor was not there and he would have to wait in the car. My father recounted that he put a bloody hand on the glass door and said, "Lady, the doctor is here. Open the door." When he went back to the car to bring us inside, he realized he could not lift my 3-year-old sister because of his shoulder injury, even though he had earlier dug my younger brother's leg out of the frozen ground beneath the plane. Even then, the evening was not over. The small-town doctors had little experience or training with trauma and nearly made my injuries worse by not protecting my neck after a head x-ray. My father had to get up off the recovery bed and direct our treatment until a helicopter arrived to take us to Lincoln, where he practiced. My father was very upset about the treatment we received. Together with a few other doctors, he created a training course in trauma that is now required in over 70 countries and has saved thousands, if not millions, of lives. There is now an award given annually in his name by the American College of Surgeons for meritorious service. My siblings and I made full physical recoveries, but I have retrograde amnesia and have no memories before waking up in the hospital 3 weeks later. Story 11. When I was about 9 and my sister was about 3, she sneaked onto the back porch as we were preparing to leave for the gym and fell into my grandparents' pool. Nobody noticed until one of them turned around to see her floating face down. My dad rushed through the door to the patio, jumped into the pool, pulled her out, and gave her CPR until she coughed up the water and vomited a bit. He continued giving her chest compressions until the emergency medical services arrived. If he had been even seconds later, she would have died and I would not have a little sister. Also, my dad was very poor well into his mid-20s. While I might not agree with the morality of the company he works for, the man has built an impressive career and life for himself considering where he came from. He made a lot of mistakes in my childhood and hurt me more times than I can count. But there is something to be said about someone who recognizes their problems, works on them, and gets better. I did not mean to sound so stilted, but it has been 25 years and it is still hard to talk about. My brain just does not work right when I try to explain it. Story 12. My dad died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was unconscious for days, and right at the end, he woke up and started talking like nothing had happened. They call that the calm before the storm. My nephew and I sat with him and had a 45-minute conversation about life, death, and how he wanted to be buried beside his brother. His exact words were, "Everybody has to die. Otherwise, there would be nowhere to park and all the good jobs would be taken." He said, "I lived the best life I could. I was honest, and I have no regrets. I'll keep my chin up when they come and take me to wherever I'm going." His last words were, "Okay, boys, let's rest for now. We'll talk later." He never woke up again. Ironically, when he died, I was sitting beside his bed, listening to music on headphones really loud because he had the death rattle. When the time came, I jumped up and was beside him as he took his last breath. The song Hero by Foo Fighters was playing on my headphones. I couldn't listen to that song for years, but now whenever it comes on randomly, I just let it play because it's my pop. It's been 9 years, and I still cry for that old man. Story 13. He had to leave Berlin when the bombings took place. Eventually, he returned and had to deal with Russian soldiers in occupied Berlin. He brought his post-traumatic stress disorder to America and had low-paying jobs until he became a doctor. I still don't know how he did it. Story 14. Stayed with his squadron after running out of ammunition during a ground attack mission. Simulated strafing runs to draw anti-aircraft fire. Story 15. On a laundry list of things. The radiator broke and leaked overnight in my old 2000 Subaru Outback nearly 10 years ago. I woke up that morning and saw fluid under my car. It must have happened after I parked the night before. I called my dad that morning. Thankfully, he lived nearby and picked me up. We went to AutoZone or another store for a replacement. We went back to my place to replace the radiator and hoses where my car was parked on the street. Within a couple of hours, we finished, and I still made it to work later that day. Thankfully, I had an afternoon shift. All he had was his toolbox in his car trunk. It was impressive how he did it so quickly and mostly by himself, with me just helping hold something or grab a tool. Growing up, I was always there to hold the flashlight while he said every curse word in the dictionary as he worked on his cars. Story 16. A story my dad told me about 30 years ago, where he was accidentally brave in the moment. Really, he was just very angry and not in the mood to care, so he behaved recklessly. His words: he was a kitchen manager at a restaurant. A man came in to rob the restaurant at gunpoint. My dad was already having a terrible day and was upset with everyone in the kitchen. The man came in with the gun, went to the register near the kitchen, and demanded all the money in the till. My dad said that when the man came around the corner, he was yelling about something. The man pointed the gun at him and started talking. My dad did not remember what he said, only that he shouted back, "What?" The man repeated, "Give me all the money." My dad, very angry, opened the register, grabbed the till, slammed it on the counter, and screamed, "Take it then and get out," while pointing at the door. The man ran out without taking the money. He told me this story as I was starting my first job at a fast food restaurant because he wanted to make sure I followed the rule. Just comply if someone robs you at gunpoint. They are probably scared and only there for the money, not your life. It is not your money anyway, so just hand it over. He shared why he was foolish for not staying calm in that moment, but also what he learned. An armed robber is probably just terrified. Story 17. Shot a man in the skull with an arrow when he tried to break into our home. It did not kill him, but he had to have it surgically removed. Story 18. My dad managed the largest dynamite bust in the history of our state when he worked security at a Kmart. Story 19. Living in the bush for weeks at a time, scrub clearing in remote New Zealand in the late 1960s. Hit a piece of number 8 wire while cutting down a tree. The chainsaw kicked back and sliced his thigh open below his groin to the knee. He stitched up his leg with fishing line and a fishing hook. Cut off the straggly bits with tin snips. Rode his horse 3 to 4 miles back to his car and drove to the hospital. He had the most intense scar, like a train track down his leg, and scars for every stitch hole as he used nylon fishing line. Story 20. When he was dying of cancer, one night he was up late in the living room trying to rest on a recliner. He heard and saw 2 young men trying to break into cars on our street and went out to confront them. One went toward him, so he grabbed him and held him on the hood of our car while the other acted tough. Dad said to try him, but he chickened out and ran away, soon followed by the other guy. I don't know how my dad had the strength to fend off 2 guys much younger and not dying, but he did and saved our cars. Story 21. Story time. He was riding his motorcycle on a long, mostly empty desert highway, and a car kept cutting him off with absolutely no use of their turn signal. At a red light, my father pulled up next to them, reached through their window, said, "I guess you don't need this," snapped off their turn signal actuator, and drove off. Story 22. He once stole a Brinks truck and picked up a sex worker with it, but never got caught. Then he fell in love with her and got married. That is how my father met my mother. Story 23. Hiked most of Yellowstone while battling lung and spine cancer. Caught a snake mid-strike at my face and threw it into the woods. Had a final destination moment when a dump truck rear differential smashed through his windshield and crushed his collarbone and lung. He went to work the following week. Story 24. My dad and brother came to see my new band play, the first real band I was ever in. A drunk man came over and sat at their table, acting rude and challenging my dad. My dad wasn't the biggest guy in the bar, but he had over 25 years of experience working behind a bar, so he knew how to handle the situation. He calmly tried to get the man to calm down. My brother, barely 21 and new to the Navy, related the story like this. Dad kept deflecting. The man was drunk, so neither of them thought he would be a serious problem. Finally, the man challenged Dad to a fight, and Dad said no, he doesn't fight someone who can't hold their liquor. The man said he had only been drinking beer. Dad responded that the man was weak because he couldn't even handle beer. When the man started to make a move, my brother, who was 6 feet 4 inches tall and a former lacrosse player, stepped in. It was his first leave since joining the Navy. He grabbed the man's collar and escorted him out of the place. The bouncer knew they were family because they were on my guest list. My dad was prepared if needed. I doubt he would have had to do much, but he didn't back down to someone 30 years younger and 30 pounds heavier. Story 25. He's not rich by any means, but he has a degree in finance and is very responsible with money. His credit score is in the 840s. He took me to co-sign on my used Honda that I was buying and asked about the interest rate on the loan. The guy said, "Well, it really depends on your credit." And my dad, who is usually pretty reserved, cut him off, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Credit is not going to be a problem." I don't know, maybe that's lame, but when he did that, I thought, oh wow. Story 26. I have two stories. The first is my personal favorite, and the second is probably far more impressive. My dad was a captain on Boeing 747 aircraft for Pan American World Airways and United Airlines. He was a pilot in every branch of the armed services except the Air Force, which had not offered the kind of missions he was interested in. Due to his responsibilities, he was very by the book at work. I don't recall the exact year, somewhere between 1990 and 1992. His flight from Tokyo to John F. Kennedy International Airport had about 20 hair metal musicians from various bands who had just played at a festival. I don't know if it was in Japan or if that was just their connecting flight. It frustrated me that he couldn't remember the names of any of the bands, except Skid Row, which he only remembered because of this incident. About an hour after they left Tokyo, the flight attendant started complaining about a drunken rock star being loud and obnoxious in first class, being inappropriate with the flight attendants and rude to other passengers. Without hesitation, he walked right back into the cabin and gave Sebastian Bach the same kind of lecture he gave my siblings and me when we were troublemakers on road trips. He told him that if he heard one more complaint, he would turn the plane around and go back to Tokyo. Then he would have the band detained by the exit so they could be introduced to every single one of the over 300 passengers as the people responsible for ruining everyone's travel plans. He then marched him to the galley where all 5 feet 6 inches of my dad, a former Marine who looked like Bob Newhart, made the 6 feet 3 inches loudmouth tough guy Sebastian Bach apologize to the cabin crew. He took him back to his seat and made him sit down and put on his seatbelt, while all the other rock and roll types quietly snickered at him. The rest of the flight was quiet and orderly. I was a skate punk who hated Skid Row, so I really enjoyed that story when my dad got home. In the spring of 1976, my dad was the flight engineer on a Pan American World Airways Boeing 707. After landing at Entebbe Airport in Uganda to refuel, they received a warning over the radio that the Ugandan military was on their way to the airport to arrest everyone. They cut their refueling short and took off just before the military made it to the tarmac, with Idi Amin leading in one of his famous convertibles. Passengers swore that Amin and his men were firing at the plane as it took off, but I don't believe that was ever confirmed. A few months later, the hijacking of an Air France plane ended at the same airport in the famous Operation Thunderbolt. He narrowly missed at least 3 terrorist attacks in his long career, one in Rome, one in Tokyo, and one somewhere in South America. Every one of his countless flights landed safely. After he retired, he flew as a passenger maybe only half a dozen times. I think he felt he did not want to tempt fate. Story 27. I was a new corrections officer working crazy shifts, and we had just moved. My little sisters really wanted Christmas lights that year, and in their letter to Santa, they asked him to magically put some lights on the house. I remember waking up around 3 or 4 a.m. and looking outside to see my dad on a ladder, stringing some lights up. It was one of those moments where you realize, he will always be that dad to me, up on that ladder, hanging lights at 3 a.m. Story 28. He saw his son, my brother, lying in a casket and had to forgive himself because they were not talking when he died. He, my brother, was not talking to me or my parents at the time. It was not easy to do. Story 29. I am old. My father was a navigator and bombardier on B-29 aircraft flying out of Saipan for over 30 missions bombing Japan, and he survived them all. Story 30. Jumped out of a moving work truck to defend my mother from someone who was threatening her. Story 31. I, a 14-year-old male, went camping with my dad in a canoe. We paddled across a lake, then carried the canoe a few hundred yards to another lake, a process called portaging, and repeated this for several days. Every night, we threw a rope over another rope tied between 2 trees about 20 feet above the ground to suspend and protect our food bag. Sometimes we did not see any other people for 24 hours. About 3 a.m. one morning, I was awakened by my dad swearing and crawling out of the tent in his underwear. He yelled at me to get the flashlight. I shined it on him as he walked toward the fire ring. "Not on me, on the bear," he said, pointing upward. A bear had climbed the tree and was holding on with 3 paws, slapping our food bag with one front paw. I would say he was 6 feet tall and weighed between 400 and 500 pounds. My dad picked up 2 cooking pans and banged them together while swearing at the bear, who climbed down and stared at my dad for a moment from a distance of 15 feet before running off into the woods. As my dad climbed back into the tent saying, "I could smell him before we ate dinner," I was completely silent, fully expecting him to give me instructions on how I should make my escape at the expense of his life. I honestly thought he was going to sacrifice himself while I ran for the canoe. I waited, but he said nothing. Then I thought he was listening for the bear's approach again, and I became even more frightened. After about 5 minutes, my dad started snoring. This, ladies and gentlemen, is impressive. Story 32. I'll answer for my father-in-law instead of my dad. 4 reasons I will explain. My father-in-law has 2 sons. I'm married to the good one. My brother-in-law is the bad one and had 2 kids as a teenager. Last year, it came out that my brother-in-law had been raping his own daughter and 2 of his cousins over the last 15 years. My father-in-law is a very principled military man, with 4 years in the Army and 20 years in the Navy. Upon finding out his son did this to his granddaughter and nieces, he punched his son in the face, kicked him out of their home, and told him he'd kill him if he ever came back. My father-in-law is 2 to 3 times my brother-in-law's size. For reference, when my brother-in-law was arrested later, the black eye was clearly visible in his mugshot. During the trial, my mother-in-law went to court every day because she needed to know what was happening to her son, though she knew he was guilty and wasn't hoping he'd be set free. My father-in-law refused to go and instead spent every day of the trial and court hearings driving his grandchildren to and from school, making sure they were safe and knew they were loved and taken care of. My brother-in-law was recently sentenced to 40 years in prison with 30 years suspended so he can get out in 10 with good behavior, but everyone in the family thinks he'll either die in prison or misbehave so he can't get out in 10. If he does manage to get out and shows up at my father-in-law's house, my father-in-law will kill him for sure. In contrast, when my dad found out his best friend had been raping me when I was 18, he cried on my shoulder because he was so sad he couldn't be there for his brother while his brother was going through such a hard time. So no, I can't think of any badass things my dad has done, and I don't talk to him anymore. My father-in-law knows all this and is so sweet to me. He always calls me sweetie. He knows I love pineapples and pineapple decor, so every time he sees me, I just realized this weekend that it's every time he sees me, not just on holidays when gifts are typically given. He says, "I was out and saw this pineapple and it made me think of you, so I got it for you." We visited them for the 4th of July, and this time it was 2 yellow pineapple votives with flameless candles. So yeah, my badass veteran father-in-law beat his pedophile son's ass, served as bodyguard and carpool grandpa for his grandkids, and buys pineapple decor as his love language for me. Story 33. Got through his depression, suicidal thoughts, and drug problems. Worked very hard at a difficult job so we could have a decent life. Gave up playing in a band that he loved because with work and the band, he was away from home too much. Apparently, every time he would pick up the guitar, I would start crying. Moved halfway across the country for a government job to provide us with a better life while being able to be home more often. Stopped my mother from essentially trying to kidnap me because she hated it so much out there that she was willing to take me away from my dad. Then divorced my mother, which spared me from having to deal with her problems every day. Story 34. I grew up in a rural forest area. One night, when I was about 8, I woke up to flashing lights bouncing around my bedroom. My mom came in and said the neighbor's house had caught fire, and my dad had to break down his door to wake him up. The amazing thing to me was that it was never mentioned again. He never thought to talk about it or brag about saving our neighbor's life. He lived the rest of his life without seeming to think much about what he did. I only remembered it the week he died. Story 35. Carried the Olympic torch in the 1990s. They organized a cross-country run where people could be nominated to run a specific leg of the route, just a mile or 2. I nominated him and he was chosen. The torch is in my parents' living room. Story 36. He took one of my Hot Wheels race cars with him when he broke the sound barrier during an Air Force flight. He returned it to me and said it was now supersonic. I still have that car. Story 37. Watched him face 4 men, one of whom had a baseball bat. He was beaten badly but endured it like a champion. Story 38. Worked every minute of overtime for years so my mother could raise us and then spend his free time making his family happy. Story 39. Had 3 children after he turned 50, worked multiple jobs, and still found time to play with us and attend every event. As someone with young children and an aching body in their mid-30s, that man deserved a medal. He is in a home with dementia now and told me a few days ago he wanted to take the day off work to come and help me around the house, still trying his best. As a bonus, I was having a rough time as a teenager and got into a fight with my grandmother and stormed out. I knew I would get in trouble and was hiding in a local park. Not only did Dad know exactly where to find me, he sat with me, told me he understood my frustrations, and encouraged me to come home with him and apologize. He knew when to be strict and when to talk. Story 40. Very first wave at Omaha Beach. The only survivor in his landing craft. This was followed by 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. After the war, he returned to serve as a military police officer at the Nuremberg trials. Story 41. Raised 3 children independently and took the opportunity to start a company while we were all in elementary school. Story 42. He is very intelligent and was born in 1931. He still works part-time as a chemical engineer and safety consultant. He has played a significant role in establishing safety standards in the industry. He discovered the causes of explosions and how to prevent major explosive accidents. He continues this work at age 94, part-time. He also remains active by running and playing tennis. He has visited approximately 60 countries for both work and tourism. He traveled to Antarctica earlier this year. I am currently working on a video interview with him about his life, and what I have learned has made his story even more interesting. He is a knowledgeable and quiet person, somewhat anxious but very kind. He is not a stereotypical tough man but still remarkable. I am the youngest child from his second marriage. He was a single father to my older half-brothers during their teenage years after his wife left. He had me in his 50s and I am a millennial. Taking on the responsibility of starting and raising a second family after his first grew up, and remaining active for so long is impressive. Some people criticize older parents for having children later in life, but my father proves them wrong. I believe most of my eccentric traits come from my mother. Story 43. Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. 173rd Airborne Brigade, 75th Infantry Regiment, Ranger Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol. He never told us about his service. He told our mother he worked in a supply battalion during the war, and she never really asked for more details. No medals, memorabilia, or photos. He has spent the past 40-something years working as a chemist. We found out he was in long-range reconnaissance patrol when a man claiming to be a Huey helicopter pilot came to our door in 2012. He told me that my father had saved his life when his helicopter, which was also carrying a long-range reconnaissance patrol team, was shot down during an extraction. My father and 2 others jumped out of their helicopter and held back a Viet Cong counterattack until more air support arrived, allowing them to be extracted. That pilot was the only survivor of the crash. After that day, my father was more open about what he really did in the war. Now at 79 years old, he tells the same stories he used to, but they often have more new details. Story 44. Carrying groceries from the car, he stepped on a huge nail stuck in a piece of wood. It went through his foot and poked out the top. He continued carrying the bag up the stairs and into the house with the wood nailed to his foot. Story 45. Worked the graveyard shift 6 days a week. He slept while we were at school and coached sports in the afternoon when we were in elementary and middle school. In high school, he attended all of our games and meets. He only missed one of my track meets because of an appendectomy. He only missed 1 day of work for that, having surgery on his day off and taking the following day off as well. He is a strong and dedicated person, was and still is. Story 46. I watched him fix a printer by getting mad about it not working, picking it up, and throwing it across the room about 6 feet in a small room. Miraculously, the cables remained attached, and it started printing when it hit the opposite wall. Sometimes you just have to remind technology who the boss is, lest it rises up and becomes insolent and rebellious. Story 47. He did selective logging. He logged trees that could only be accessed with horses to pull them out of the woods. He had big Clydesdale horses and worked by himself. He was a First Nations man from the British Columbia interior. He survived residential school, but it left a scar on his soul. Story 48. Worked on the electrical systems of all the Apollo command modules. Became a quality engineer overseeing the inspections of the tiles on the space shuttles. All that with only 4 years in the Navy and no college education. Story 49. Some of this predates me, so I'm hearing it secondhand. He came to America to get his Doctor of Philosophy degree. Right before he left, he got engaged to my mom with a promise that he'd come back and marry her when he finished school. My dad came from a farming family in a third-world country village with no plumbing and no electricity. He managed to get multiple master's degrees. My mom came from a middle-class family in a bigger city. Meanwhile, her family got tired of waiting for him, so they got my mom engaged to another, wealthier man. My dad finished graduate school, came back to their country, and found out about this other man. He wasn't having any of that. He had a polite chat with my maternal grandfather. Long story short, a couple of months later, he and my mom were married. A year after that, they had my oldest brother. A year after that, they moved to America for good. Times were so hard that even with a doctorate, the best my dad could initially do was work on a canning line at a factory in a small town. Fast forward 30 years later, he was forced into early retirement due to restructuring. However, at this point, he was a global regulatory auditor for the Fortune 100 company he started with as a line worker. He has flown over 1 million miles with 3 different airlines. Despite disliking them, he sponsored my mom's entire family to come to America. My parents had 4 kids, a doctor, a realtor, and 2 lawyers. He is now in his 80s, but still travels to do consulting work in Asia and South America 3 or 4 times a year. The other remarkable thing he did was continue living after my mom passed. He was about 10 years older than her, and her family is known for having exceptionally long-lived women. They were married for about 40-some years when she passed. I can't call them the perfect couple. Some may say they were toxic, but they were truly the type who could have a massive fight with lots of swearing and insults and then 5 minutes later have completely moved past it. When he would leave for a work trip, my mom was pretty fed up with him. However, the moment his cab turned the corner out of sight, she'd immediately begin counting down when she'd hear from him on the phone and when he'd return. My mom had many mental and physical health issues, but my dad sacrificed basically anything and everything to make sure she always had the best care possible. He absolutely refused to let her be put into any kind of home or facility. He doted on her day and night as her physical health deteriorated in her last couple of years. He set up everything financially to ensure my mom would be fully taken care of when he passed, since she was always a stay-at-home mom. So there was a massive shock when she passed before he did. For a while, I thought he was just going to fade out due to a broken heart, but eventually, he picked himself up and has continued to make his way through life. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I know he'll be relieved the day his time comes so he can reunite with my mom. He'll probably also cuss her out for a while for messing up the plan by passing before him when it was supposed to be the other way around. I really don't know why I just wrote all that, but it felt good to get it out. I've told people on several occasions that if I can even be half the man my dad is, I'll consider my life very successful. Story 50. My mom's new boyfriend decided he didn't want kids in his apartment. So my mom told me to call my dad because I needed a place to sleep that night as I had to be out by sundown. I called my dad in tears. He was at work. After the divorce, my dad decided to live his best life, bought a sports car, and had a bachelor pad. Anyway, I was sitting on the front porch crying when my dad's Fiero came to a screeching halt in front of my mom's place. He got out and told me to sit in the car while he talked to my mom. My mom's new boyfriend came out, and before he could say a word, My dad grabbed him and dangled him over the edge of his second-story balcony. My mom came out, and my dad calmly told her to pack my things. He said he would have people come get them in the morning. Then he told the boyfriend that if any of my stuff was mishandled in the meantime, he would come back and break a limb for everything damaged or missing. My dad moved me into his tiny apartment. I slept on the couch for a month until he could break his lease and move us to a bigger place. He got custody and made me his priority until the day he died. My mother is still alive, but I very much consider myself an orphan since my dad passed away. Story 51. He worked the third shift with untreated depression so that there could always be a parent at home with two neurodivergent children in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the resources available to help with or even understand the issues we had were much more limited than they are today. Story 52. Grabbed a man in a motorcycle club by the base of his ponytail, lifted him off the ground, pushed his head into the ground, and made him apologize to my mother for saying something insulting to her. Story 53. I was helping my father frame an addition to our local fire station. At that time, I was struggling and spent the entire night running around, smoking meth and causing trouble with no sleep. Despite that, I showed up at 7 a.m. ready to help. I climbed onto a scaffold that was balanced on an interior wall and only supported in the middle. As I walked toward my father, who was on a ladder nearby, the scaffold began to tip. I was about to fall 20 feet onto concrete. He grabbed the end of the scaffold with one hand and yelled at me to back up. He saved me from serious injury that day. I am grateful to him every day. Story 54. My younger brother and I were accused of something in high school that we absolutely did not do. We had done questionable things before, but we always owned up to them. That is probably why my dad believed us when we said we did not do this one. He was called to a meeting at school. In the conference room that day were my brother, me, the accusing teacher, and the principal, who was the accusing teacher's father. The principal made it clear, if we admitted to the transgression and apologized, we could resume classes with a few Saturday detentions. If not, we would be suspended. My dad knew what we would say, but for effect, he looked at us and asked, "Boys, what do you have to say for yourselves?" The accusing teacher looked smug, assuming my dad, as an adult, must be on the school's side. We replied, "We did not do it." The principal was surprised. The teacher was angry. They both waited for him to get the truth out of us. Instead, he stood up and said, "I believe my boys." Then, to us, he said, "Let's go home." Story 55. Drove across the country in one night to pick me up because I was in a hit and run on the way back to my house after visiting him. Story 56. Cut a hole in the living room wall and set up a small fan blowing into it. On the outside, it connects to a weatherproof enclosure that stays air-conditioned all year. Inside, there are shelves and bedding. This was done for the stray cats in the area that my parents look after. The cats use it all the time to beat the extreme Arizona desert temperatures, which reach up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and drop to freezing during winter. It actually works. Story 57. Survive in a Red Cross van that was shot at in Lebanon. He was sitting behind the driver's seat in a Red Cross van trying to get through the war to help people. The van was shot at, and my dad was one of the survivors. He came out unscratched. That is the most courageous thing I have ever heard. Story 58. Literally never called in sick. Worked every shift at his job, which he held for almost 40 years. He provided a middle-class lifestyle for us, and Mom always had a decent car to drive us around. We never missed a meal and were always allowed to go to Disneyland and class trips. He bought me a car in high school. I just had to pay for gas and insurance, with no car payment. How he afforded that and saved so much money, I'll never understand. We had vacations every summer, dirt bikes, a boat, and more. When he passed away, he left us over $1 million to split between the kids. I'll never understand how he afforded all of that on one income and saved so much at the same time. He really was a cool guy. I miss him. I miss his jokes. His jokes weren't typical father jokes. They were raunchy, witty, and completely original. Dad liked to drink. In his last few years, he was very sick. After a doctor's appointment one time, I said, "Do you want to know the results or not?" He said, I don't know, should I? I said, up to you. After some thought, he said, okay, tell me. I said, well, you're not in too bad shape. Your electrolytes are slightly off, but that was normal and due to drinking, and everything else looks pretty good except your liver is somewhat damaged. Without missing a beat, he chuckled, took a sip of his beer, and sarcastically quipped, wonder how that happened. That was him. That was my dad. I miss him. Funniest guy I ever knew. My brother is a close second, along with grandpa and my uncles. Story 59. My father was difficult, but when my mother was ill and needed dialysis and a lot of care, he really stepped up for her. Surprised me greatly. Story 60. He was unloading items from his large work van, and little 2-year-old me managed to climb into the cab without him noticing. It was parked on a hill with my brother behind the van, and beyond him was a busy road. I took the van out of park, and it started to roll toward my brother and then toward the road, so we were both in serious danger. He managed to stop the van with his body long enough for my brother to get out of the way. Then he quickly ran to the cab, moved me aside, and applied the brakes. Story 61. Told the company owner he would quit if the owner tried again to fire the company's best concrete finisher, who happened to be black. Dad was the construction foreman with 5 children to support. This was the early 1960s in a racist small town. He had no backup plan if he left and truly needed the job. I have great respect for Dad's principles. Story 62. He bet his career and his reputation on his company being able to successfully develop a revolutionary cancer drug. It all worked out. Story 63. Where do I start? My father's life was stranger than fiction. You would not believe the stories if I told them. For example, when he dealt cocaine, I would come home from the bar and see him at the kitchen table with girls I went to high school with. Story 64. My dad used to be a painter and carpenter and worked for Joe Walsh a lot. He would also sell cocaine to Joe Walsh frequently back then. Story 65. Moving to the United States in 1978 with nothing and making something of himself. Hardworking, smart, determined father. Story 66. My dad served in the Korean War. It was called that to reduce benefits paid. His troop came under fire from above. Everyone hit the floor and hid. My dad and a buddy grabbed guns, went around the back of the hill and killed the sniper. He rose to the rank of sergeant major. Story 67. Lived a humble life as a consistent family man. Throughout almost 40 years of marriage, she never once had to worry about him cheating, gambling, or drinking. He raised 3 children who all love and respect him. Story 68. Delivered a message behind enemy lines, eliminated several enemy soldiers, was shot twice, and saved his platoon. Received a Silver Star for his actions. Story 69. He roughed up the bully who was picking on me after school. Nothing major, just tried to scare him out of messing with me. But that was not the cool part. The cool part was when the bully's father, also a bully, showed up at our front door trying to intimidate my father. My father calmly stepped onto the front porch and proceeded to beat him all over our front yard. I never heard from the bully or his father again. Story 70. When I was a kid, my parents had a store. My dad was upstairs in his office, which overlooked the sales floor. My big sister was on the register when suddenly all the normal store sounds stopped. Dad looked out the window and saw a man pointing a gun at my sister, trying to rob us. Dad grabbed his rifle and stopped the robber. He had taught marksmanship in the army. My dad will forever be our hero. Rest easy, Dad. We miss you. Story 71. He drove from one town to the town I call home in 27 minutes. It usually takes about an hour to drive between those towns as they are 78 kilometers apart. Story 72. Go bald with grace. Laugh and joke about it while sporting a Picard haircut. For all his faults and other insecurities, my father was not bothered by male pattern baldness. This was also generally before balding men would just shave their heads. Story 73. I witnessed it. I saved a 10-year-old child who went overboard on a small yacht sailing under the Golden Gate Bridge in choppy water. My father dove in after him, even though the boat was moving quickly. Another boat picked them up, We never sailed with that family again. Story 74. My father survived the Normandy campaign only to be injured in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest and lived without ever speaking about it. Story 75. Combat medic in Vietnam. 2 Bronze Stars, Air Medal, Purple Heart, and gave a severely wounded soldier mouth-to-mouth CPR for 30 minutes straight in a helicopter getting evacuated from a long-range reconnaissance patrol to a hospital in Siu Chi. Saved his life. Story 76. Something happened a while ago where a mentally unstable neighbor was threatening one of my brothers, who was probably a teenager at the time. He has Asperger's, so sometimes he upsets people without realizing it. Maybe he assaulted my brother or threatened him. I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. My dad said he would handle it, shook his head, picked up his rifle, and drove over to the neighbor's house. He went alone and calmly came back around 20 minutes later, locked up his rifle, and probably started to read a book or watch TV afterward. I don't know what happened and don't need to know. I don't think that man has ever spoken to anyone in our family again, and he probably was very scared even if the rifle stayed in the truck the whole time. My dad is quiet, stoic, generally calm, but also 6 feet 3 inches tall and 250 pounds. A mountain of a man, a farmer and hunter, and it's understandable why that man likely was very scared. Story 77. He was the first person in Europe to computerize a newspaper. Before I was born, he was the only white man playing on a black baseball team in Muskogee. When I asked him how that happened, he said, "Well, the white team said they did not have room for me." Story 78. My father put a 2-state multi-office corporation out of business because they were corrupt. They had fancy, expensive attorneys on their side from prestigious schools. He attended a small local law school, had one investigator researching the corporation, and worked for the government. Story 79. Dad is white. A man told my half-black nephew, "Get out of the way," racial slur, while we were entering Lowe's. My nephew was walking a little ahead. I don't think the man realized we were related. My dad punched him and said, "Let's get the hell out of here." We got in the car and drove off. Nobody spoke in the car. Story 80. Stopped a rape in his underpants. We lived on a farm on a very dark lane. A man grabbed a barmaid on her way home outside our farm at 1 a.m. She screamed. Dad was out of bed, through the front door, and over the double gate in a heartbeat. That was no mean feat. Dad is 6 feet tall and burly. Not fat exactly, but big. I almost feel sorry for the man. Almost. He looked up and there was this 6-foot, nearly naked gorilla wearing swim briefs bearing down on him. The man ran. Dad carried the girl back to the gate where Mum was standing with a shotgun. Dad fired both barrels of buckshot at the fleeing man, who was well out of range, and sent the 2 farm dogs, Alsatians, after him. They came back 15 minutes later, looking disappointed. It was 1980. I was 10 and watched the whole thing from our bedroom window like I was watching a Marvel film at an IMAX. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.